Okay, so we are now recording. So formally welcome to our weekly call, sponsored kindly by the DNS OARC team. So thank you, DNS OARC, for that. Right, let me share my slides, which I trust you can now see on your screens. Right, so just as a reminder, focus of the call this week after a sort of a 2-week hiatus. Welcome back to our weekly call. The sort of main sort of focus of the call this week, I'm going to just reference a few things that arose last week during the LAC Domain Names week, part of the ICANN DNS Symposium. So I'll reference just briefly a few things from that to talk about, and then, time permitting, we just talk about sort of the recent developments from the news, some forthcoming events, etc. as always. Without further ado, I'm going to dive in to the LAC Domain Names Week. Perhaps I'll just take a step back, just a reminder. So the ICANN DNS Symposium takes place annually. Over the last 3 years, I think 3 years ago, it took place in Brussels, last year in Da Nang, this year in Santa Marta. The intent, as I understand it from talking to the ICANN team, is they try to go to places where the ICANN main meeting doesn't go, and if possible to pick locations slightly off the beaten track in order to help with capacity building in different parts of the world. So having been in Asia last year, South America this year, next year I believe they're looking at either the Middle East or Africa as a probable sort of continent, sort of, if you like, semi-continent at least, although it's a little way off before they finalise the actual country and the physical location. And then they tried to hook up with some sort of local engagement. So last year it was with the Vietnamese NEC. This year it was with LACNIC for sort of South and Central America. As well as both last year and this year with OARC. So last year, the biennial OARC meeting, I can't remember what it was, took place co-located with the DNS Symposium. This year, rather than the OARC meeting itself, it was a DNS Community Day sponsored by OARC that took place, as well as some 2 days of sort of more sort of local programming as well. So 4 days of content in total, broadly themed around the DNS ecosystem. I'm just going to cherry pick a few things that came up from that activity. So clearly I'm not going to sort of do justice to 4 days worth of discussions. I did learn fairly early on day one that even in Colombia itself, there are apparently something like 6,000 ISPs. Which is pretty extraordinary. So quite a different sort of ecosystem to what you might find in probably most European countries, just in terms of the sheer number of ISPs. For various, I think, sort of geographic and economic reasons. A few other interesting things like that, but I thought I would just pull out from the agenda from the Wednesday, which I put on the screen. That's the agenda you can see for the DNS Symposium day itself, and I'm just going to pull out just briefly a few points from that, or a few presentations to sort of signpost those things that you may wish to look into And in fairness to ICANN, already they've got for the symposium day both the slides and the recordings already up on the ICANN DNS Symposium webpage. So these are already available for viewing. Which is good news. But so from those things I sort of picked out, Sean Lloyd, for example, gave from the ICANN office of the CTO, gave a presentation on some work that he's undertaken, looking at various third-party reputation data. Some of these, at least, I would characterise as sort of threat feeds, like Spamhaus. And he's just really been looking at them at various characteristics. So, for example, the number of phishing reports within the feeds. You can see on the chart on the screen where the numbers varied quite widely between the different feeds. And what he was trying to do was to understand the level of overlap versus unique content. And one of the other slides he put up showed that on the whole, certainly this selection of 7 feeds had largely unique data in each one. There wasn't a lot of overlap between them. And that's important because I think they're looking to see how they can harness them to tackle DNS abuse as part of the official ICANN efforts. And this is DNS abuse as defined by ICANN. So it's quite a narrow definition. I know some of you will be familiar from some of our other calls. It doesn't cover every aspect of DNS abuse as many of us would understand it, but it does at least address some of them, such as phishing. So they're not really interested in spam per se, but they are interested in spam when it's used for phishing or malicious content and some other types of DNS abuse, but not all DNS abuse. On the whole, outside of phishing and malicious content, ICANN doesn't really sort of think about the content of stuff. Its interest is focused elsewhere. To sort of fulfill its brief, I guess, and also the wishes of those people that participate in its various fora through the year. But anyway, I'd certainly recommend if you have a general interest in reputation data, that take a look at Sean's presentation, and I will share links to all of these with the email after the call. I didn't have a chance, have time to get it all onto slides today, as I only got back in the UK on Saturday and had some family stuff to do on Sunday. So apologies, normally I'd have this done already, but you'll have it when you get the link to the recording. Another member of the ICANN team, Andy Newton, sort of touched on the next round of global top-level domains and some proposed changes there. And again, I sort of just fished out a couple of things that struck me. For example, with a few caveats there, they're contemplating, just to support the use of DELEG. You'll see from the slide in the middle of the screen, which I'm sure Tal, who I think is on the call, will be pleased with. I know Ralph would be. Ralph was also present in Santa Marta with me. So that was quite interesting. Even at this early stage, they're thinking about DELEG, which so I was quite surprised to see that, if I'm honest. And also, the slide on the right, you'll see that in addition to on the DNS transports comment, you'll see in addition to supporting DNS over UDP and TCP, that registry operators may also offer support for DO, DOT, and/or DOQ as well. So again, some relatively new technology, certainly in the case of DOQ. So quite surprising to see that already being added, or at least being thought about being added to the to the agreements for the new global TLDs. I think I'm right in saying time frame for the global TLDs, I think they're looking at assignment in early 2026, I think. If anyone is better informed on that than I am, feel free to either jump in or pop something in the comments. But I think that was the plan, that they start the process early next year, and I think it rolls through until early 2026 for completion, but or there or thereabouts. Okay. There was also a presentation, in fact, there were two presentations by Chinese academics, both of whom were remote. And if I'm honest, the combination of the sort of time delay and acoustics in the room, and we had a few connectivity issues at one point, meant it was quite hard to follow what was being said. But nevertheless, this one stood out to me because they've done an evaluation of, as you can see from the title slide, the first open source implementation of oblivious DNS. And just for clarity, they do specifically mean oblivious DNS, not oblivious DO, that they looked at specifically. And you'll see on the slide towards the bottom of the screen why they're interested in oblivious DO. Sorry, oblivious DNS, apologies. That's because of compatibility with existing DNS infrastructure. So they've done some performance evaluation, I think the early signs of which seem quite promising. As you can see, that's using the Go language, which if I think I recall, I think it was AdGuard also used Golang for their oblivious DO or oblivious DOQ implementation. If I recall the presentation from Andre roughly a year ago now. So interesting that Go seems to be the choice of language for these things. Anyway, Chinese academics are looking at that, I think was the main message. Worth looking at the slides. I certainly on the day the audio was hard to follow. I don't know whether the recording will be slightly clearer, but because I think the connectivity issues were with the in-room earpieces and so on, so it may not be quite so bad if you listen to the actual recording, but it was certainly difficult to follow the presentation audio on the day, but definitely worth a look at that. And then finally, Alan Durand, I think also from the ICANN team, has been doing some work drilling into data from APNIC, as it happens, from the the rich data that Jeff Houston and team have, to try and understand how widely used open resolvers are in the different countries across Central South America. And he noticed some interesting behaviours. I just randomly picked one of them from one of the slides. Detail doesn't matter. It's showing the volume of traffic going to different open resolvers, and you'll see, and this is a slide on the right hand side of the screen, roughly 3/4 of the way across the time period covered, it suddenly jumps quite sharply. And there were a few abrupt changes, both upwards or downwards, with different ISPs in different countries. He hasn't got to the bottom of why that is yet, but he was just highlighting some of the differences. I think he's planning to reach out to some of the ISPs to understand if it was something that they'd done on their networks, which with the abrupt changes was probably the case. But also the level of traffic again varied quite widely. I think on the whole, I think globally, Google carries about 7% of traffic. Cloudflare somewhat less than that. Clearly in this particular instance, this chart, it's a lot higher than that. And Cloudflare is the sort of dominant carrier. That's not true globally. So there's obviously some slightly unusual behavior with this carrier in this country. So again, he's trying to understand what some of the drivers are behind that. So I think it's very early days in his study, but the fact he's looking into it, I think, it is pretty interesting. And as you can see from the slide, he's got 7 months worth of data that he's got from APNet to. So it's quite a lot of data points given. I think Jeff pushes out. I'm not sure the exact number. Is it maybe 10 million? Of his micro ads on the Google Ad service a day. So it should be statistically significant, even if you cut it down to countries and split by carrier, if you're looking at 7 months worth. But no doubt there'll be more on that in due course. But it's early days, but the fact he's doing it, I think, is worth knowing. I think, yeah, that was probably it. Yeah, in terms of the things I was going to call out from the DNS Symposium day, things that caught my eye. Yeah, this is the agenda for the. This is the agenda for the 4th day, so the DNS Community Day, as it says on the top of the slide. Sorry, just slightly thrown for a moment. Again, all the slides are already available. I'll put a link with a link to the recording so you can access those should you wish. So the Community Day, we didn't do anything remotely. It was purely done in the room to try and make it more interactive within the room. I just call out a few things just briefly. So the roundtable discussion, probably the main point that came out of that was, in terms of concerns, was lack of access to capital was highlighted as one of the root causes that was perhaps impeding innovation and investment, even where there were compelling business cases where there would be a good return on investment. They didn't have the upfront capital to get things moving. So that from the discussion, that was probably the overriding point that came forward. That was better access to capital, I think, would be very beneficial in the region. Other things I'll mention just briefly. So looking at session 3, I'll shamelessly point out I gave a presentation on encrypted client hello, just highlighting why that ought to be something of interest to ISPs amongst others, and what some of the implications were that they need to be thinking about. I'm happy to expand on that if anyone's interested.
So I heard that.
Go on, Michael. We lost Michael. The audio suddenly cut out. Don't know, Michael, if you were trying to say something or unmuted accidentally, but if you did have a question, feel free to unmute and come back in when convenient. Okay, yeah, so I talked about ECH. Ralph gave an update on DELEG, explained what it was and some of the thinking behind it, as he's done on this call previously. So I won't sort of run through that again, but yeah, if you look at his slides, I think you'll be familiar with the content of that if you've sort of if you recall the sort of previous several discussions we've had on DELEG on this call. And then the other thing also in that sort of section of the day, Phil, the sort of still relatively new president of DNS OARC, talked about sort of best current practice, and I think posed the question whether it be useful for OARC to sort of pull things together to sort of share best current practice in different areas with the community. He touched on the sort of kindness initiative that ICANN kicked off, for example, as a sort of thing where maybe they could help sort of signpost people towards sort of relevant best current practice in different areas. So I think that's something they're going to be exploring over the coming months. Beyond that, I mean, there's a lot of other stuff. I've obviously only skated over the surface of this, but just to give you a flavour for some things that were covered. Other comments, it was a fantastic location on the sort of north coast of Colombia, just on where it edges the sort of Caribbean, which was very nice. So 32 degrees, quite a contrast to Northern Europe. So fun coming home, but never mind. The only disappointing part was the relatively few participants locally actually attended, which is a shame because obviously, as I mentioned at the start, part of the intent here is to foster capacity building. There was good support from the Colombian government. They had a vice minister present for the first 2 days in their entirety, who took part, so gave some presentations and so on. So it's just a shame that there weren't more people present from the community, either from Colombia or elsewhere across the region. There were some people, but I think not as many as the organisers would have hoped for. So I think they'll reflect on that before going ahead with the next event, which, as I said, is likely to be in the Middle East or Africa. In terms of support for local attendance, I'm just looking in the chat. I don't know, to be honest. I think obviously partly by having it located in region, it makes it less expensive to get there, but that's still going to be an impediment. But I don't know whether there was any sort of financial sort of support to help offset the costs for any attendance. So good question. Not sure is the answer, but as I say, I think ICANN will be just trying to sort of dig into that a bit before sort of pressing on with their next event, although they are committed to do one next year. I think they wanted to do one in each of Asia, South America, and then either Africa or the Middle East before just pausing to see if it was an effective tool or not. The one in Vietnam, I think, was pretty successful in terms of local attendance, clearly less so this time round. So we need to understand what the differences were behind that, which may possibly be, I don't know if there was subsidy in Vietnam, for example, or not. But that's the sort of thing I think they'll want to understand. Okay, I'll stop there. I don't know if anyone else got anything you want to add or any questions. I know some people attended remotely if you weren't there, so in person. So if you think I've completely missed something really important, feel free to jump in and say so. Or as I say, if anyone's got any sort of burning questions, feel free to unmute and ask now as well. So just stop for a moment before pressing on. Okay, it doesn't look like anyone's typing, and clearly no one's unmuted. I don't know if, Michael, you wanted to unmute and come back in if you were trying to ask a question or make a point earlier. Remind me, you've got technical problems, of course. Maybe you can't unmute. Okay, right, well, let's move on. If anything does occur to anyone, we can come back to it in a short while. Okay, so let's just move on. Those of you that are on the mailing list will have had the sort of news headlines earlier today. If you don't get those and want to, just drop me a message and I'll add you to the mailing list. But you'll see there's quite a lot this week. I'm not going to go through all of the sort of news items, but I probably will just briefly touch on the ones on this slide. Maybe not so much detail on the rest. So, in order, rather topically, given I've been talking about ICANN stuff, there was some coverage this week about VeriSign agreeing to some changes to how it administers .com, including some new takedown rules. You'll see some coverage about that. And also there's some sort of draft text. This is in the next version of their registry contract. So it includes new text on DNS abuse, denial of service attacks, and also some additional reporting obligations. Although I think VeriSign's agreed to the content of the draft text, it's currently out for public comment, and there's a link to the public comment site on the screen. As well. So if anyone's got any opinions on that, you can certainly take part in the public consultation should you wish. But yeah, personally, it's good news that ICANN are continuing to push for more on DNS abuse mitigations within the contracts for the registries. I think that's personally, I think that's a good development. Also, Peter Thomason of DSEC has done some further work on post-quantum cryptography in DNSSEC. He published something in, I think it was in the RIPE NCC blog a few weeks ago. He's done a further piece working with the DNS for EU open resolver. And he's done a write-up about that. He's highlighted an issue as a result of the testing with the XMSS signature scheme in DNSSEC, and also some more general concerns to do with support issues concerning legacy devices and some legacy resolvers when handling post-quantum cryptography. So those of you with an interest in DNSSEC and indeed or in post-quantum cryptography, you may find that well worth your time to sort of taking a look. And then finally on this screen, you'll see two pieces relating to Cloudflare, coincidentally. One, they're doing some work to try and get some ISPs and equipment vendors to basically embed support for their resolver when they sort of enable support if it's an ISP for new customers, or indeed when equipment vendors ship their hardware, that it's embedded within the hardware. And you'll see a note I'll put at the end of that, which is, in my view, Quad 1 is absolutely not the right choice for a mass market resolver because it doesn't filter malicious content. So hopefully anyone that did embed Cloudflare, it would be either 1112 or 1113, which filter either malicious content in the case of 1112, or also filter adult content in the case of 1113. But Quad 1, I think, would be a terrible choice as a default in any mass market product or service. And then bottom of the screen, I think we've touched on this in the last week or so, Cloudflare has begun enabling support for encrypted client Ho on their free tiers. And there's a bit more detail on that in one of the latest blog posts. And in fact, since actually putting this together, I've also seen some more text from Cloudflare explaining how you can disable support for ECH on a paid for tier. As far as I can tell, you can't disable support on a free tier, though. I think it's enabled and you're stuck with it, I believe. But trying to just confirm that with Cloudflare this week, hopefully. Okay. There's a whole bunch more stuff that you'll see. I probably won't go through all of these given the time, but sort of best practices on DNS from Vicara, a bit more on CCTLD phishing characterizations from Giovanni at SIDN Labs, and also confirmation that the acquisition of Vicara by DigiCert has now completed, amongst other things. And then finally, perhaps more usefully, there's some new member state guidance on Article 28 of the NIS2 directive, which has just come out from the NIS Cooperation Group, and Centre have done a write-up about that. Just Polina, who some of you may know from the Centre team, the Director of Public Policy, has put together a piece just reflecting both on the guidance and also giving some additional context on the legislation itself. A reminder that we will be touching on NIS2 next week on this call with Michael. So that's quite timely. I don't think it's probably useful to cover anything else on there, but you all have this. You can read this at your leisure as appropriate. And then a whole bunch of other things coming out in the news this week. Probably too much to cover usefully, but again, you've got these to peruse at your leisure. Should you wish, but there's a whole bunch of stuff, as I say, in the news. Seemed to have quite a rich week for interesting content. Going through this yesterday, so it's all good. In terms of some deadlines coming up, if you want to get support to go to ICANN 82 as part of their sort of next generation of the community, there's a deadline on the 11th of October, so I think there's some financial support. Just go back to the question that Simon asked in the chat earlier, so to attend one of the ICANN meetings at least. There's a call for applications for the Cyber Resilience Act Expert Group in Europe coming up on the middle of the month. And also there's an offer of support for Global South journalists to attend the IGF 24 event in Riyadh at the end of the year. Again, deadline middle of the month. And finally, in terms of middle of the month, RIPE 89 Lightning Talk proposals. There's a deadline of the 18th if you want to put forward any proposals for that. Just so roughly, a couple of weeks before the meeting takes place in Prague. And then, as always, there are other deadlines sort of rolling through the year to be aware of, but you can catch up those. They're a bit less pressing on time. And then finally, forthcoming events. You can see there's an event taking place starting tomorrow, the Atlantic Convergence event in Lisbon, Morgue, not that far away. The WTSA in New Delhi, middle of the month, etc. So plenty of things to keep you interested. Also including, I probably ought to mention, DNS OARC in Prague, 26th, 27th of October. Immediately followed the next day by RIPE 89 starting. That's on the 28th of October in the same venue. I'm running through to the end of that week, and then the day after that, the ITF 121 meeting starts in Dublin. So there's a whole host of things running, and if you're not in any of those, for example, but you're in the UK, then you can see on the 5th of November the UK IGF is taking place. So if you can't make it to Dublin, or the IGF isn't your thing, perhaps you want to focus more on policy stuff, there's always the UK IGF if you're in the UK, and so on. Okay, and I've mentioned next. I haven't updated this, apologies. Ignore what's on the screen. So next Monday will be Michael talking about NIS2. Apologies, I'll change the slide when I send these out. I must have missed that. I was clearly tired yesterday, still slightly jet lagged. Apologies about that. Right, and I think that's probably it from me. So let me stop talking. I can see someone. Sorry, I may have missed this. Nigel, Simon, even you'd raised your hand. Did you want to come in with something?
Yeah, just a quick one. I'm going to suggest that any anybody wants to be a CRA expert probably needs to make sure that they're an EU citizen and that they work for an EU-based company, because they're pretty particular in the EU at the moment, as we are finding in various SDOs as we keep cutting across them.
Yeah, I must admit, I hadn't clicked through to see that, but so that you think that's a fundamental requirement then to fulfil that particular role, if that's an aspiration.
That's what they're pushing for most roles. So from like I haven't read it, but I would suggest you read the subtext carefully if you're outside the EU, or you're not an EU citizen, and or both.
Fair enough. Okay, useful point. So maybe take a careful look at the T's and C's. Anyone that had an interest in applying to do that. Thanks, Simon. That's a useful heads up. Right. Anything else that's on anyone's minds this week, or anything you want to pick up on that I sort of briefly covered, talking about the LAC Domain Names Week, and sort of the DNS Symposium, etc., or anything, or indeed anything else that you want to refer back to. And if so, either just follow Simon's lead and raise your virtual hand using the reaction tool in the Zoom client, or put something in the chat, or just unmute and talk. So if you want to jump in with anything, now's your chance. I'm not seeing anyone unmuted at the moment. It doesn't look like anyone's typing. Nope. No, don't think so. Okay. All right. Well, I hope that was useful. As I say, I'll share some links to the actual contents where they're available, the recordings of the sessions from last week, if you want to watch those properly. Certainly worth your while. There's definitely some useful stuff there. And equally, as I say, if anyone doesn't get the weekly news headlines and wants those, just ping me an email and I'll add you to the mailing list, so you get them from next week onwards. But other than that, well, I hope that was useful. Have a fantastic week, and look forward to catching up next Monday and hearing more from Michael all about NIS2. I think roughly a week or so, a couple of weeks before it is due to go live within the European Union. So catch up with everyone then. So bye everyone, speak soon.